We have Claire and Sarah, and
Jacques was here.
cool, Jacques just disappeared. That's fine. Now, how are we going to do this? There'll be a presentation. I know we've had, I think, 6 workshops on this now. Sorry, Jacques, Jacques running through the door. I'm going to move, and Councillor Dalton will second the recommendations. And we will send, there's a couple of extra ones through conversations this morning. We will send those round long before. I'm sure there's going to be questions and debate. We'll send those round in a minute. Right, who's going to lead off? Kia ora, Jacques. Thank you. Sorry to fluster you by jumping ahead.
Kia ora tātou. No, all good. I shall lead, and with me I have my 2 colleagues, Claire and Sarah. And I will just get straight into it. I'm not going to go through all of the detail of the FDS. You would have seen that, so I'm just going to highlight a few things that are all captured in the report, and then we'll move on to questions. So, just in terms of what the future development strategy is, well, it's a 30-year spatial plan for how Auckland will grow and develop, and it is required under the NPS Urban Development. So it's a legislative requirement for us to do this FDS. The aim of the NPS, and therefore also the FDS, is firstly to create a well-functioning urban environment, to integrate land use and infrastructure planning and the investment that goes with that, to ensure that we have both sufficient housing and business capacity for 30 years, to support housing affordability by creating competitive land and development markets, and also to support greenhouse gas emissions reduction and resilience to the impacts of climate change. So those are the aims of the NPS, and therefore we have to reflect that in the FDS. So how do we do that? Well, in essence, the FDS continues Council's approach to growth over the last decade or so. That means the multimodal approach that we've had, that most growth are in brownfields, but that there is also growth in greenfields, and that growth is focused around centres, rapid transit stops, walkable catchments. We just generally call that good locations. So when I speak about good locations in the other slides, that's kind of what we mean. It is important to note, however, that this FDS has 2 significant differences from the current and existing development strategy. The first of that is how it deals with exposure to natural hazards, especially flooding. And what the FDS does is that it identifies a number of priority brownfield areas for adaptive planning. And as you would know, some of that work's already underway. The second bit in terms of flooding is that it removes 4 greenfield areas from future urban development, and that is related to the protection of life and property, and it red flags a number of areas in the sense that those areas drain to floodplains and therefore contribute to what happens further down the floodplain. The second key difference is that this FDS recognises Council's infrastructure and funding constraints a lot more. And what it therefore then does, it changes the timing of some of the greenfield areas of when Council can deliver that infrastructure. We're talking bulk infrastructure here. And the second thing that it does is that it introduces infrastructure prerequisites for development. Again, this is the bulk stuff. However, in addition to introducing those prerequisites, it also creates a pathway for development to go earlier if the private sector wants to do that. And it sets out how that would work, how that could happen, acknowledging that not all infrastructure always has to be paid by Council, that sometimes the private sector can fund that infrastructure, or that there are alternative funding mechanisms. And if agreements about that can be achieved, then development can go earlier. So those are the two key differences from the existing development strategy. So just briefly, what we heard from the feedback, there was over 10,000 submissions to the FDS, and there was comment on all of the topics, across all of the topics of the FDS. So generally speaking, there was strong support for the approach to growth, so that being the majority of growth being in brownfields, but also growth in greenfields, 66% support for that. The approach of focusing development near centres, stops, those good locations, 74% support for that. Avoiding growth in those areas where there's significant risk, 80% support for that. And prioritising nature-based infrastructure, accounting for climate impacts, 74% support for that. Across all of the comments, the biggest theme that came through really was around infrastructure. For example, that there needs to be public transport improvements, especially in those higher density areas and those areas where growth is actually happening. There were concerns about the capacity of our water infrastructure, considering the weather events in 2023. The view that infrastructure must accompany brownfield development, and when greenfield development happens, that we have to provide that infrastructure. And also that it is not all about hard infrastructure. There is also the urban amenities and the social infrastructure, and that is equally critical. And that must be delivered at the same time or in parallel with where housing is actually happening. There, of course, was also opposition to the FDS. It wasn't all, everybody supported everything. So in terms of where people did not support aspects or all of the FDS, that generally related to things such as a view that brownfield growth puts too much stress on the existing infrastructure, and that any brownfield growth would require significant infrastructure investment. There were concerns about the delay or the timing of particular future urban areas. There was a view that there should be more and new greenfield development, that the FDS should enable that. So in other words, that more rural land should be turned into urban development. There were disagreements with the infrastructure prerequisites that we had, so the approach, and also the idea of embedding the principle of that approach, so not the projects, but the principle into the RPS. A view that there was no pathway for going earlier than the timing that we have indicated, and that there was no discussion of alternative funding options. There was disagreement with removing some of the future urban areas for urban development. These are the ones in the floodplains. There were views that climate should not be considered as in the FDS, that climate change isn't happening. There were also views, people who did not support the FDS on the basis that it didn't go far enough. Views, there's too much greenfield development, not enough climate action, etc., etc. Out of the 10,084, to be precise, submissions, 256 of those were from organisations. A very wide range of organisations, many of whom did actually support the FDS, the approach, so not all organisations disagreed with the FDS. Included in those organisational submissions were a number of really substantial submissions, big ones. They generally covered kind of all of the FDS. the general approach to growth, but also very specific land interests that people have across the region. In terms of local boards, 20 of the local boards supported the approach, being the focusing growth in existing urban areas, how the FDS approaches significant hazards, the concept of infrastructure prerequisites, and much more of the FDS. They also raised many local board specific matters, and where possible and related to the FDS, those changes have been made in the FDS. Important to note that even though there was strong support from local boards for the intensification, so brownfield growth, it came with a caveat, a number of caveats. For example, that there has to be investment in the brownfield areas, in those communities that are actually growing. That there needs to be sufficient green space that comes with that growth and accessible green space, that the investment has to be equitable. So what local boards mean by that is those areas that have already seen significant growth and that has not have had the investment in infrastructure and services to go with that. That is part of equity and that needs to be addressed. There were also some views that greenfield investment is diverting too much of the funding away from brownfield investment. And what local boards were also calling for is that more local planning happens in those areas, in the areas where the growth is actually happening. And you would have seen changes in the FDS to reflect that. There were also process concerns about how we went about preparing the draft FDS. These came from some of the pro forma submissions, a number of the significant substantial submissions, and one of the local boards. And what they generally asked for is that the FDS be stopped or paused. Some of the reasons for that is that there was not enough and sufficient pre-engagement with the development sector prior to the draft, a perception that there was a lack of information and no housing or business assessment to base the FDS on, views that Plan Change 78 must not be taken into account in the FDS, and that the housing and business assessment capacities cannot be estimated while Plan Change 78 is on pause. Just to note that that is in contradiction with what the NPS tells us. The NPS is very clear that we have to take Plan Change 78 into account. And also the view that the new government will bring in new legislation. So that was just a quick run through on the feedback we received. In essence, what the FDS says, or what the FDS contains, it's got 5 overarching challenges, that being the uncertain environment that we are operating under, that we need to adapt to the impacts of climate change and also reduce emissions, the challenge of council's funding constraints, the ongoing environmental degradation, and that growth needs to be equitable. So those are the key challenges that the FDS aims to address. That then leads to 5 core directions, being to avoid enabling any further growth in places that would put people in harm's way, to focus council's funding to achieve the greatest benefit, and to continue with a quality compact approach to growth. And that then results in 5 key actions. First being to remove future urban areas where development would put life and property at risk. The second being to prioritize, this is in brownfields, to prioritize adaptation planning in those areas that need it most. To identify a small number of priority areas for council investment, to enable more growth in those areas that have fewer constraints, and to support local level investment. You would have seen from the two track change documents that you've had many changes in response to the submission. So I'm just quickly going to run through some of the key ones. So there's a new executive summary in the version today. The Te Tiriti section has been amended significantly. It deals with the treaty growth and development. The development capacity section, so that's both housing and business, has been significantly updated. In terms of brownfields, the need for brownfield investment, so as we intensify and where we have already intensified, that is further addressed. In terms of greenfield, the infrastructure prerequisites have been significantly redrafted and a pathway created for going earlier. Also the role of the private sector funding or alternative funding, that has been significantly expanded. Also in terms of greenfields, the future urban areas for investigation. So you may remember in the draft, there were a number of future urban areas that had this label of to be investigated further. We've completed those investigations and all of those future urban areas remain future urban areas. None were removed for urban development. And also in terms of the greenfields, there have been some changes to the timing of some of the future urban areas. For example, bringing the Whenua Pai business land forward to 2025. The priority section has also been substantially redrafted. One of the big changes there is the introduction of infrastructure deficit priority areas. For example, Pakuranga in Unitec, Te Atatu South. The approach to significant hazards, significantly redrafted. The brownfield approach, so where we identify those priority areas for adaptive planning, that remains the same. But those areas in the future urban zone, 4 areas are proposed to be removed due to flooding. So these are areas that are within some of those significant floodplains. That process, of course, will be followed with a detailed plan change. And the FDS doesn't actually change the zoning of that land. And through that plan change process, the exact boundaries and the zoning that then gets applied to that land will be part of that process. There are also changes in terms of what is called red flagged areas. In this case, these areas are not within the floodplain, but they do have downstream effects. And so these are red flagged to indicate that there are significant stormwater requirements for development to happen. Development is still appropriate. It is just the stormwater that needs to go with that. In terms of future growth locations, that section has also been substantially redrafted. It now identifies more specifically particular areas that one could expect growth in the longer term, so years 11 to 30. For example, Swanson, Henderson, Botany, Onehunga. There's a whole new section on approach to iwi development. We've also added a map and text around critical and lifeline infrastructure. This was in response to some of those providers. The implementation section has been redrafted to reflect all of those changes. Some of the appendices have been significantly redrafted. For example, Appendix 4 on development capacity, 6 on infrastructure prerequisites, 7 on future urban land, and Appendix 8 on the red flagged areas. And then there were numerous changes throughout the document to reflect feedback, smaller things that you would have seen. So just the last slide, Chair, to recap. There was strong support for the draft FDS, though of course there were also many concerns and opposition raised, suggestions made for changes. We have made significant changes to the draft based on that feedback, to reflect that feedback. to note that the broad approach to growth is essentially the same as what Council has been pursuing over the last decade or so, but there are two key differences. The one is about protecting people and property from future harm related to natural hazards, especially flooding. And the second key difference is protecting Council's ability to invest by fairly spreading the infrastructure investment across the region and getting the greatest benefit from that investment, and expecting those who want to go earlier than when Council can fund infrastructure to fund that infrastructure themselves, or to find alternative mechanisms for that funding and entering into agreements with Council. And then lastly, just to note that any plan change process, that if the FTS is adopted today, any plan change process that is underway or that might come in the future needs to have regard to the FTS. That is exactly the same as the current development strategy, so a plan change process needs to have regard to that as well. And the key is that it is have regard to. It does not have to give effect to or any other. It needs to have regard to that. That's probably enough from me, Chair.
Kia ora. Thank you, Jacques and Claire and Sarah and the team. Huge amount of work to get the draft out, but then to have such huge support from community and submitters, 70, 80% in most of the areas is quite phenomenal, but then to also be able to change the document based on feedback in all those ways, in quite significant ways, but also there's little nuanced changes throughout based on feedback has been really appreciated. So we can definitely say that we listened and took on as much as possible, but also acknowledging that there was huge support throughout the submissions. We have a few questions. Councillor Darby first.
First up, didn't expect that. Thank you, Jacques. Thanks, team, for doing this work. It's been a long haul, started a long time ago. Look, I know, Jacques and team, you've gone over and above in terms of taking further feedback, and different emails have been coming in. But I am just wanting to quiz you, and possibly legal, on the suggestion that came in yesterday from a submitter. I don't need to name that submitter, but they're a significant housing provider, about the timing, and that there is actually within the legislated MPSUD that there is room to delay. Now I've looked, I think it's section 312 from memory. I'll just go to it. I think it might be section 312 about the preparation of the FDS, and it outlines things there. I didn't quite see the precise wording as contained in section 312 being referred to in the email. But can you just, I want that final assurance that there is a requirement to do this, to inform the LTP, or at the same time as. Can you just tell us what the requirement of us is in terms of timing by the law?
Sure. And I'm aware of the email that you're referring to. I was included in that email, so I have seen that. Yeah, so section 312(1)(b) of the NPS says that the FDS needs to be prepared in time to inform, or at the same time as the LTP. There were a few words missing in the direct quote from the FDS in that email. But if one looks at the rest of the NPS, there's another section that applies, which is section 4.1 subsection 2. 4.1 subsection 2 clearly says, in the case of tier 1 councils, of which we are one, that the FDS needs to be prepared in time to inform the 2024 long-term plan. So it's very specific about which long-term plan. And that's section 4.12.
Could I just add one more thing, Jacques? You're absolutely right in what you've said. I just want to also make it really clear that in both of those sections, the kind of verb used is that the local authority must. So it's not a if it wants to, or it would be great to. It does say it must prepare, it must do it within that time frame. Thanks.
And can I just test that? Informing the long-term plan. The long-term plan is, finally signed off late, mid next year. It would be end of June. But there's a whole lot of work that's already started to inform the long-term plan, and it's we'll have the mayor's direction on that not too far out. So informing it, actually, it is, I guess what I'm getting to is to inform it as best we can. The earlier we deliver the FDS, the better prepared we are to acknowledge the FDS and the LTP. Would that be a fair statement?
Yeah, and that is exactly the direction that Council has given us to prepare the FDS so that it can, in good time, inform the LTP. Because also you want that informing to happen in the draft LTP that goes out for consultation. So that is all open and transparent to the public, not something that you want to do after you've consulted people. So the whole idea is to inform the LTP that goes out for public consultation.
And the other part, just wanted to check, is under section 3.14, the FDS has got to be informed by the relevant long-term plan as well. It's got to be informed by the relevant long-term plan. So is that like backcasting to the one we're operating under now? We've got to, the FDS has got to inform the next LTP, but the FDS itself has got to be informed by the current LTP. Is that correct?
That is absolutely correct. There's another thing that it has to be informed by. That is the 30-year infrastructure strategy. So in our case now, that would be the 2021 infrastructure strategy and the RLTP. So those three things together needs to inform the FDS. That is where a lot of the projects, so the big infrastructure projects, the timing of those projects come from. It comes from the 21 LTP and the infrastructure strategy. We then develop the FDS, taking that information into account and other things, of course, and then this in turn informs the next LTP. That's exactly how it works, yes.
Thank you. Thanks, Chair.
Kia ora, Councillor Darby, and keep in mind that this is the fastest we've tried to obviously get it here, but we did, based on feedback from some submitters, extend the time, doubled the time for submissions from 4 to 7.5 or 8 weeks, and also this was supposed to come to October, but through conversations with councillors, they wanted a bit more time to read and have another, I think, the 6th workshop. So it has come a bit later to ensure that everyone was informed and had those opportunities for questions and to read the full document and all those track changes again. Councillor Turner, question.
Thank you very much. This is kind of out of my experience field, and I have to rely on you good people to inform me. Then I also read the emails that you've seen as well coming in, and I have to balance that sort of just with a gut feel I have. So, I pull out of some of these wordings, things like in the email where it refers to prioritising up rather than up and out. And then I have to balance that with the feedback I'm getting from the public. So, as I get letters, emails every second week from Kaianga saying we're going up with another 32 on number 29 to 31 and all that sort of stuff. I'm getting equally the number of engagements from the public saying we've got too much infill housing in our brownfield area. We talk about utilising infrastructure there. there seems to me to be a lot of example of the infrastructure not coping because we're overloading it rather than utilising an unused capacity. So, you know, and then I read in there that, well, the timing's been settled. Can you assure me that we've got this balance right?
Thanks, Councillor Turner. Yes, I've also seen the emails that suggest that it is only up and not out. That is factually incorrect. Of the 15,000 hectares of greenfield that the Unity Plan has identified, so the future urban zoned land, 4,018 hectares, what the FDS proposes, based on council's ability to fund infrastructure, 4,000 of hectares of that land falls outside of the 30 years of the FDS. It does not remove that land for urban development. It simply says council cannot service 4,000 hectares of the 15,000 within the 30 years. As I say, it does not remove that land, and so all of the other future urban land remains for future urban development. It is simply the timing, in many cases, the timing is pushed out a bit further from the previous strategy, again, because of council's ability to fund that infrastructure. But as I have said, there's a very clear pathway for that land to come earlier for development, if those arrangements can be made, to not put more pressure on council's debt levels. So it certainly is up and out. It is not just up. In terms of the brownfield development, the issue that you raised, the FDS strongly recognises that. It specifically talks about those areas that have already seen development and where that supporting infrastructure and services and facilities has not happened, that needs to change, and that's one of the directions that it gives to the LTP, that there has to be that brownfield investment as well, because that is what we know since 2016-17, so since the Unity Plan came in. Around 83% of all of the consent, so houses being built, has been in the brownfield areas, 83%. And so that is where the growth is actually happening, and the FDS says that growth in the brownfields has to be supported with the infrastructure and services, etc. Both in where the new growth happens, but also where it has already happened. We need to fix that issue. So it gives that direction to the LTP.
Okay, thank you very much.
Kia ora, Councillor. Thank you. Deputy Chair, Councillor Dalton.
Thank you, Chair. Oh, gosh. That was loud. Tēnā koe, Jacques, and tēnā kouroa, Claire and Sarah. Thank you for all your work. Jacques, the consultation went out to all Aucklanders. That is correct. Post the submission process, there have been ongoing conversations and communications with some of the developer community, and we can see that through the biggest track change document I've ever seen, I would say, for the feedback that we've listened to. In fact, an email came to all councillors yesterday from a developer, and they let us know that they were actually able to review the draft FDS and track change it and send it back. There were 10,000 submissions, of which 8,552 were from individual submitters. Did many of those individuals have the same input into further feedback after the submission process had closed as the development community has had? And the context of my question is around equity. It was a consultation that went out to all Aucklanders. I want to know, did the 8,552 have an opportunity to, or not just have the opportunity, they possibly did, but did they influence where we've landed today after their original submissions? Thank you.
Councillor Dalton, the short answer is no. Of course, we did not go back to all of those individuals. But I need to also put the additional engagement we had with the development sector, and that was mainly kind of greenfield development. I need to put that in context. What we did ask them was to give us more feedback on the issues that they had concerns with, which they did. The changes that that resulted in, so what you've seen in the track changes, is in keeping, I believe, with the general feedback that we received and the general approach for which there was support. Where people suggested something quite different, so fundamentally changing the approach of the FDS from the draft, we did not make those changes because that would be inequitable. That is not what we consulted on, and that is not the feedback we had. But where it was in line with the principle of what the FDS was doing, but could make it better, explain things better, give more examples, that's where we made the changes. And so we certainly did not make every change people wanted.
Thank you.
It had to be in line.
Thank you very much.
Kia ora, thank you, Councillor Dalton. Member Ashby.
Kia ora koutou. First, just acknowledging the mahi that you put in last minute in some cases in terms of, in particular, the treaty provisions. So thank you for your work in that. Just a couple of questions from me. The first is, what's your confidence level, I suppose, about infrastructure and growth areas and its ability to handle the intensification? So it's a bit of a crystal ball, which is a little bit of the point of this, but that's kind of the first question, in particular stormwater. Second question is, how does the FDS respond to concerns of iwi relating to development of greenfield sites which are not Māori or treaty settlement land? So there was one iwi in particular that commented about that. And the third one is really, it's a question about iwi capacity building in the development sector. So what does this FDS do to support more participation, iwi participation and Māori participation in the future development of the city? Thank you.
I'll do the first one, and then I will hand over to Claire to do the other questions. In terms of the infrastructure investment, what the FDS does is in line with those key directions, which was to focus and prioritise where council's investment goes. So in line with that, it identifies a number of priority areas, there are different types, for where the investment should go. The key one of those probably is the spatial priority areas, which is within the time frame of the LTP, so the first 10 years. So in terms of, and so these are brownfield and greenfield areas. In terms of the investment that goes into those areas, none of these areas are new. Many of them are actually in the 21 LTP. They are in the AMPs and the planning and all of that of the different infrastructure providers, and it comes through in the projects in the FDS and the timing. So none of that is new. In terms of, and also so in existing LTP and the input to the new LTP is that that investment should continue. But ultimately, of course, that is a decision for the LTP to be made. With regard to the stormwater aspects of that, the FDS really strong on the stormwater, especially, you know, the flooding and what everybody has seen. So it makes it clear that that is one of the key considerations for development, both in brownfields and in greenfields. What we know is that in a number of those priority areas, so say Mount Roskill, those kind of areas, there has been and is significant planning underway, integrated stormwater planning. There are agreements, say in terms of big developments like KO, those agreements are in place, the funding of that infrastructure in many cases in place. You are also aware of some of the initiatives that Council has taken and the funding that it has provided, say making space for water, that will deal with some of those issues in those areas. Also what you have signed off in terms of Resilient Auckland, which is a whole program of work in regard to this. That will continue. So there's a lot of commitments already made. There are new commitments since the flooding that Council has made. There are investments there. So one would be relatively confident that the LTP, the new LTP, will continue that and that those investments will be made.
Thank you, Member Ashby. Sorry.
Kia ora. I think Member Ashby just had a couple more questions, so I'll answer those. So the first one was around iwi land or where development is not on iwi land, and how the FDS treats those kind of developments, and that's in both brownfield and greenfield situations. So this was something that did come through quite strongly in some of the submissions from iwi around including providing for the rights of mana whenua, and particularly the development rights of mana whenua. So we have made changes throughout the FDS to acknowledge that specifically that development is an enabler for Māori outcomes, and it talks about social, cultural and economic well-being. And for example, there are changes to acknowledge that development can support the aspirations and opportunities for Māori to thrive and support mana whenua contributions to the economy. So there is a focus on the economic side of it in there as well. And it talks about that in terms of general development, so it's not specifically talking about that in terms of Māori land or treaty settlements. Yes, I'd also just like to acknowledge IMSB members' support with helping to change some of these provisions and improve the Māori aspects and the iwi aspects of the FDS. I think that the document as it is now does clarify that those developments, might be iwi owned or iwi controlled, but it also talks about significant iwi developments, and that's the FDS provides direction around what those kind of significant developments might be. It starts to provide a bit of direction around what iwi owned might be, so it's talking about suggesting that at least 50% iwi ownership, and for iwi controlled it talks about commercial developments with 25% or more iwi interests, and also if it's in an iwi planning document or another strategic document like an iwi management plan, for example. So I think those changes are specific, they're not specific to iwi owned or treaty settlement land, they're more generally to acknowledge the development rights and provide strategic direction around enabling iwi development and broader Māori outcomes. In terms of capacity building for the development sector and supporting Māori participation in that sector, I think there's some of the text in there that acknowledges the past impacts of land confiscation and the many issues associated with that. And as I've just outlined, some of the direction that's in the development strategy now is around enabling development of Māori land, whether that's owned or there's a Māori interest in that land, and it talks about the importance of development as an enabler for those broader outcomes. It also talks about the kinds of developments that the council might support, and that the FDS does not prohibit some types of development, and I'm referring to some of the text in the rural section now. And there are actions in the development strategy that talk about initiating joint priorities between the council and iwi to focus on opportunities for enabling particularly economic development. And it also talks about investigating strengthening the unitary plan provisions around further enabling the economic, social and cultural well-being. So there are some aspects that are sitting in the implementation plan that is yet to be developed, that I think will talk more to the capacity building side of things.
Kia ora, thank you for that very thorough explanation. Thanks, Claire, and thanks for the work as well that IMSB members did to help address the submissions from mana whenua and Māori organisations to help incorporate quite a lot of that feedback. I think has made the document a lot better, so thank you. Councillor Watson.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chair, and thanks for the manner in which you've allowed a lot of feedback over a period of time now. I, probably like other people, are getting questions from both for and against this draft FDS, so if you don't mind, I'll just switch between the two. So the first one goes to, and I think we reference it in the report, to the possibility of a legal challenge due to concerns about the process. So I just wanted to clear that one up at the start if I could. And it goes to the notion that the MPS requires a development community to be consulted on the draft FDS prior to broader consultation, and the view that has been expressed in some of the communications to us is that the council relied on discussions with the property council, and the assertion is that those discussions were neither consultation nor engagement for the purpose of the MPS UD clause. So I think we've received that. So could you just clarify our standing on that?
Sorry, just I'm thinking. I'm probably going to have to give a bit of an explanation. So yes, we did engage with the property sector, the property council, and that went a certain way. But that was one of the things we did, and that was not the key thing. And so I probably need to explain also what the FDS requires that pre-engagement with the development sector to be about. It requires two things from that engagement. The first is to, from the development sector, understand opportunities for significant development, so significant development opportunities, and it's up to the council to define what significance means, but that's going to be relevant. So identify the significant opportunities, and then also the infrastructure that is needed to go with those significant opportunities. So I'll explain the logic that we used. In terms of greenfields, we know that where the future urban land is zoned, the broad direction from council was that unless it is a capacity issue, broadly speaking, at this point in time, the FDS should not expand further into rural land. So not opening up a whole bunch of new rural land. so, with that kind of direction and knowing that there is sufficient capacity, we have the future urban land as it is. We are very aware of the development of that future urban land in the sense that structure planning has been done, needs to be updated, there's lots more to be done, but of course we have a good feeling for the future urban land, which of that land is housing, the kind of capacities that would come from that housing, which is business, etc., etc. So it is not a mystery what the development opportunity in the greenfield areas are. We know that. We know who the large landowners are. We know about the plan changes that have happened or that may come, some of them may come in the future. So in that sense, greenfields is not a mystery in terms of what the development opportunity is. And so our logic was, we can certainly learn a bit more about the brownfield areas and where people see opportunities for development in the brownfield areas. And so what we then did was we actually did a survey where we asked a whole number of questions, land being identified on maps, etc., etc. That survey went out to over 500 developers. That was informed from resource consent databases about people who have actually done development over the last number of years, so people who have actually built stuff. That was the key bit of input that we had and used as our input from the development sector, was through that survey. Granted, the response to that survey wasn't great, and of course one can always do better, but that was the logic, and that's how we approached it.
So thanks, Jack. So I take from that we're attributing that survey as fulfilling that need to consult prior to the broader consultation, and there's no sort of definition that would suggest otherwise in terms of the type of consultation done.
Yeah, and I should have said that that survey was done in, I think it was November last year. So it was well in advance, and that informed the development of the draft FDS.
Okay, thanks, Mr. Chair. Just a couple of quick ones following up, and the next one goes to this notion of developing brownfield sites and the emphasis that receives throughout the FDS, and the notion of costs. So some of the information is coming through from people involved in the game are saying things like typically the cost of providing infrastructure 2 to 3 times the cost due to the complexities of retrofitting, construction costs relating to apartment buildings 2 to 2.5 times that of traditional kind of terraced housing, urban land generally 2 to 3 times that of greenfield land, etc., etc. All of which means in terms of, affordability, the assertion that's come out of that emphasis then won't actually help affordability at all. In fact, those sites can end up being more expensive. Is that what are we? I mean, this is from people who are involved in this, so I'm just really keen to get your view of that, Jack.
I suppose one can think about costs in 2 different ways. There's the cost to the developer, and then there's the broader cost to council and society, to Aucklanders. And it may very well be that in some cases, the cost to developer in brownfield areas may be higher than it is to compared to greenfield areas. But I think it's really important, and that is a key thing that the FDS needs to do. It needs to look at the broader context. It needs to think of all Aucklanders and development across all of Auckland. And so that's where the other costs do come in. What we also know is that study after study in many places across the world have looked at the brownfield and greenfield cost comparison. There are 2 very recent studies that have just come out of Australia again, one in Melbourne, one in the Sydney area. One was from the Productivity Commission in Australia, and I forget now exactly who the other one in Melbourne was. But these studies over and over show that if you account for all of the costs, that brownfield development is more cost-effective than greenfield development. And so I'm aware of the costs that you're referring to and the email, but that is probably, from a particular point of view, it is the direct cost to somebody, not the broader cost. I think one must also keep in context, again, as I said, around 83% of development over the past 6-7 years has actually been in the brownfield areas. And that kind of, to me, shows one of the things you can take from that is that brownfield development clearly is financially viable to the developer and is financially buyable, I just made up that word, by people. If it was not financially viable to develop in brownfields, then 83% of the growth would not have been in brownfields. So there's some disjunct there, I would think.
And just a final one from the other side of the ledger. In a place like Whenuapai, which has been subject to, a whole spate of fast-track legislation applications, most of which are approved as far as I can see, what's the benefit of the draft FDS as it stands for an area like Whenuapai in terms of dealing with this kind of ad hoc development that that threatens to undermine the whole wider area?
Councillor Watson, you reflect something now that came strongly through from that board, and we actually met with the local board to discuss this because it is a real big issue. And one of the big concerns they also have is the unintended consequences that those disjunct kind of plan changes, and especially the environmental impacts that it's having. So, based on the feedback from the local board, the FDS now has a specific action that additional planning gets done in Whenuapai. It prioritises that whole broader Whenuapai area. So a new action and therefore more planning to be done in that area. What exactly that planning looks like, we will work with the local board in figuring that out, but it is something more detailed than a structure plan because there was a structure plan and it doesn't quite do it. So that planning is to coordinate all of the stuff that has already happened plus what will come in the future, so that there is clearer direction, whether that is for private plan changes that might come through, or even council doing a plan change for Whenuapai. Like I say, exactly what that looks like, we don't know. We try to figure that out with the board beforehand, but we'll figure out what that planning exactly does. But there's a new action in there prioritising Whenuapai to deal with exactly that problem.
Thanks.
Kia ora, Councillor, and it's my understanding under the attachments, you probably read it, Councillor Watson, but Jacques, the Upper Harbour Local Board, I mean, they've contacted me as well. They're extremely supportive of the FDS because of the reasons you've said, as far as I could tell, and the focus on trying to fix some of those issues, as well as adding the business land there. Yeah. Councillor Lee.
Yes, first of all, I just want to commend the council for the strategy process and the series of hearings, which I thought were well organised and very productive. And I would recommend that approach to the council itself when it comes to ordinary people, ordinary Aucklanders, and the long-term plan. My question relates to the list of constraints on development, and we all recognise and are aware of what these should be, especially after the weather events earlier this year. But in terms of the question of productive soils, productive rural land, and the rural economy in this region, which is not really recognised much, but interestingly, horticulture and the production of certain vegetables are a major export industry for Auckland. Auckland, as we know from our briefings from the port company, is Auckland Port is an import port. We take in more than we obviously produce, but in terms of horticulture, the Auckland region is an important, nationally important as an exporter. But when it comes down to these constraints, the role of these, what the ARC used to call elite soils, and we call highly productive land, is recognised, but there is a reference here to the National Policy Statement for Highly Productive Land 2022. My question is, how will that work in terms of the council's planning and the council's adding maps to the Auckland Unitary Plan? And obviously all of these things are constraints, but they're not showstoppers. But I just wonder how much of a constraint they really will be. So it'd be good to hear that. Thank you.
Councillor Lee, you are correct in making the observation that the rural section is not necessarily as big as some of the other sections. One of the reasons for that is the NPS does not apply to rural areas. It is only urban areas. But we kind of felt, in the case of Auckland, it is all one system, and we really need to include at least some parts, some sections, some bit around the rural areas. So that's probably why it is not as extensive as the urban, because it really needn't be in the FTS. But it is part of one system, and we felt it needs to be in there. In terms of the NPS productive soils, essentially what that NPS says is where class 1, 2, and 3 soils, 1, 2, and 3, and just 1 and 2, class and 3, 1, 2, and 3 soils, that is not, it can't be used for urban development. So we identify the soils, mapping through the unitary plan, and then according to the NPS, that cannot be used for urban development.
Thank you.
Kia ora. Thank you, Councillor Lee. Councillor Williamson.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chairman. I'm just going to ask only one issue regarding this, because you've done so much work and so much consultation and so much input. My question centres around timing. In 24 hours' time, the general election results will be announced, and we'll know who can form a government. And whether it's the two parties that we think or the three parties that it might be, they've all made it very clear, and I've looked at their policy statements, that they are going to change the national policy statement on urban development quite dramatically. Quite dramatically. In fact, 180 degrees in some cases. Why would we be doing something today that might be working under a complete change national policy statement in a month's time? My analogy, I think, would be like if the International Civil Aviation Organisation said next month we're going to announce new requirements for aeroplane design, dramatically different to the old planes we had designed, but you would still go ahead and order some new planes from Boeing today knowing that they would not work into the new regime. Why would we just not delay this for at least a month? See what the direction of travel of the incoming sworn-in government is, and then decide are there any changes we should be making to this?
Councillor Williamson, I read the policy of the new government slightly differently from you, in that you're correct. They want to do a 180 degree turn. on the resource management reforms. They, but I have not seen them having that position on the NPS. And so what I kind of, from the policy position, from the National Party, what I see, the things they are wanting is that, first of all, they want to force councils to open up enough capacity for 30 years growth. So in the case of Auckland, based on the assessment, the housing assessment, our 30-year demand would be 226,000 dwellings, and what we have feasible, infrastructure ready, all of that stuff, including the margins, is 270,000. So Auckland has the 30-year supply that would be required if they go that way. What their policy is also is that they want to increase density along transport corridors. So that's kind of the same as what the NPS does, not the RM reforms. That is also what the FDS does. It kind of emphasizes the growth in those good locations along transport corridors, etc., etc. What they do want to remove or give options on is the MDRS, which is separate from the NPS. The FDS, God, this gets, the FDS does not bank on the MDRS. In fact, it criticizes the effects, the implications of aspects of the MDRS, that is not a good way for Auckland to grow. So it's not pro-MDRS, but yes, that is what they want to remove and give councils more discretion on how they go about that. Councillor Lee just raised the highly productive land. They do want to change that to make it LUC 1 and 2, not 3. They want to remove the 3 out of that. They also propose new funding and financing tools, very much in line with what we've got in FDS. We certainly do need more of those tools. And kind of what their policy statement says is that councils will be free to determine whether those additional dwellings come from further greenfield development or additional density in areas suited for that growth. So their position is not a blanket one of no intensification. They're actually very supportive of intensification in those good locations, and that is what the NPS kind of focuses on. And so that's what the FDS is responding to. But yes, they have expressed views on the RM reforms, and that probably will change significantly. But that's not directly related to the FDS. So that's my read of it.
I don't think that quite answered my primary question. Why would we not wait for at least a month and then bring this back when we knew what that direction of travel was?
I suppose, Councillor Williams, in terms of a month, what they have said is that they are going to begin work now. But of course, any work in terms of what they may change is going to take quite a bit longer than a month. That's probably going to be next year or whenever that might be. But I don't think a month is going to change anything, in that we will not know what the new direction is. We can only kind of go on the policies they've stated so far, and in terms of that, the FDS is not contradictory to any of those policies. In fact, it is quite aligned to some of that. So yeah, I don't know that a month is going to make any difference.
Okay, it's just that one person who I think will be a senior minister says the FDS is a complete anathema to the incoming government, so I don't quite know how you have that as an answer.
Through the chair, if I could just add as well, look, you're right, this all needs to be balanced ultimately. It's not our decision, it's yours. But going back to that first conversation or question that was raised about what the law says at the moment to inform the long-term plan, for rightly or wrongly, we felt that it was useful and important to continue with this for that matter alone, let alone the fact that any change coming from this government is likely to take some time, but we don't know that. But on balance, we felt it was the right thing to keep going and bring it to you today.
Thank you, Councillor Williamson. And I have looked through the policies too, and largely, because National was a part of writing these laws, they are wanting to keep nearly everything that is in the NPSUD. Apart from the MDRS, they want to give options, but that's not to do with the FTS here. And it would require law change, which would take, I assume, months, if not a year or so, to change a full NPS. There would need to be quite a lot done on that. Councillor Fletcher.
Thank you, Chair. And I don't particularly want to get into the benefits or disbenefits of the specific aspects of the recommendations today. And I acknowledge that there has been a huge amount of work done on it. But what I'm interested in is my role and my responsibility to discharge my vote appropriately. And I completely appreciate that officers feel that they have a statutory obligation to recommend the adoption of the FTS today because of the law. But the reality is that adopting it today does rather ignore the reality that legislation is likely to change. My question is specific to Megan Tyler as the head of strategy, and it's not so many, how many months, years ago was it, that my question to you was, would the sky fall in if I didn't vote for what was then Plan Change 78? And I was given all sorts of reasons given by yourself and others that was our requirement under the legislative framework that we were working in. I noted later that even though those same imperatives were put on to councillors in Christchurch, they didn't vote for it. And I've given a lot of consideration since then as to what my role is. I'm not here as an officer of council. I'm here as an elected member in a governance sense to discharge as a governor of the city what I think is the prudent thing to do. And I guess we're all united around wanting to do the right thing for Auckland, but it's whether we are being prudent in making decisions on this today, where we may then have to unravel them potentially into the future. So my question again to you, Megan, is will the sky fall in today if I want to see this delayed until we have greater clarity around what legislation may be forthcoming? And I know that you will probably want to bring in our in-house legal counsel to give me advice on this. I'd like to know whether or not there's been independent legal advice, because I'm receiving a raft of different advice on this, and it's my feeling, my judgment at this point as a governor, that it is possibly prudent to wait to get a clearer sense of direction. So Megan, I don't want to pose that to Jack and co. I want you, because this is a strategic issue, and as our chief strategist, so to speak, I need your advice on this.
Kia ora, Councillor Fletcher. Thank you, and I absolutely understand your question. Firstly, just harking back to the Christchurch or the Plan Change 78 situation, you're right, I absolutely did advise that that was the law, and that clearly our advice would be that you would need to progress that through. You're right that Christchurch City Council didn't. They obviously since did, because the government and others had a talk with them, and they therefore applied the law to a decision, and they have since continued on through that process. In terms of this one, I guess my advice is going to be the same fundamentally, is that, as I've said, there's a must clause. This is what we have been required to do under the National Policy Statement. However, I will also say that, of course, it is within your right to not do that. The sky is not going to fall in. I'm not going to argue that it will. What it will do, obviously, is, and as we've said before, the timing, both in the NPS but also for us, was we thought this would be useful for you as you deliberate on some very difficult decisions you're going to need to make through this long-term plan process. And we thought that this would be useful for you for that purpose. If you don't do that, we will remain with the development strategy that we have at the moment. So it's not as if we have nothing, but the changes or the differences here that Jacques has outlined, particularly around flooding, natural hazards, and this ability to afford infrastructure is really important to you. I know that, you as a council, I mean. And so the changes that we're proposing there won't be in the current situation that we have. So if you chose not to decide it today, the sky would not fall in. We would be, yes, in breach of a requirement that we have. And as always, we would need to wait and see what might happen with the new government, how quickly they may want to change something or not. They may not change it at all, of course, and we would still be in breach. So clearly my advice to you is, this is a requirement, my advice to you would be that you would need to comply with that. But it's absolutely within your right not to do that, or to wait a bit longer, or to seek some other kind of resolution or situation to come into the future. I hope that's helpful.
That is helpful, Megan. Thank you for assuring me that the sky is not going to fall in today. However, perhaps you could give us some insight is if there was a fundamental change, a legislative change, how much work would that entail, commencing all over again?
That's a really good question, and again, it's just a guesstimate, isn't it? Because of with all of these things, you just never know the extent of the change and how different that is to the kind of existing direction that we have at the moment. I think what we have said, certainly as we're entering into the long-term plan process and some other items that come to this committee, is that there will clearly be some change in this whole area of resource management and land and growth and housing and infrastructure. There clearly will be. That doesn't mean, though, that the changes that might be made are entirely different to the direction that we're going. So look, it's really hard for me to say. I think there might be areas, particularly say in the resource management space, where there'll be a repealing of a lot or some or all of the current of the new legislation. To put something back in again, that's going to be a lot of work, and we would want to be part of that with the government officials doing that work. There might be some other things that would be more like tweaks, and so that it would be less work. Really hard for me to tell exactly what that might look like. But there absolutely will need to be more work coming as a result of this new government, just as there was when the previous government came in. And so we'll need to prioritise that with your guidance around what we prioritise and how much effort we put into it.
Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Fletcher. And I think Christchurch was a good example, I think, at the time, but in the end they're actually ahead of us now because we delayed during hazards. They're in the hearing stage, or the hearing may have reported back. So they largely approved. They did wait for some extra information, but they largely approved their plan change as is in the end. Councillor Newman.
Yes, good morning, Chair, and thank you very much. So, Jacques, as you know, you and I have been in some discussion for some time regarding some points which are very important to me, and I'm sure you appreciate that. I want to go to Takanini, which has really become ground zero for a bit of a debate. So would it be fair to say that the reason why you're treating Takanini North in that red hatched sort of flagged area different from Takanini South is that whilst they are in the same catchment, and whilst developments in any part of that catchment will have effects in terms of one's ability to manage stormwater, that the key difference is that in Takanini South, that is deemed in the flood, overwhelmingly in the flood zone, and that the relative cost of the mitigations for stormwater are beyond the capacity of council to wear that cost, and therefore Takanini South is treated differently to Takanini North. Have I summarised you fairly, or if not, can you explain the difference?
Councillor Newman, very fairly. I would add one more thing, probably Takanini South. It isn't just about the ability of council to fund stormwater interventions. It really is also the principle of allowing more development, so therefore putting more people within the floodplain. And the very high risk of that not being able to mitigate. So everything you said plus the addition of allowing more development within a significant floodplain.
Okay, immediately south of Takanini South is the catchment Awakiri, which is also in a floodplain. It is very flood prone. It reflects similar characteristics. In that location, previous council determined that it would intervene to provide very expensive, in my view, frankly, almost gold-plated stormwater mitigation through Awakiri wetlands and the artillery tunnel. Rightly or wrongly, that decision was taken. Those people live in that floodplain, and there has been a significant change. There are three areas here, two which are in a flat floodplain, one of which we have acknowledged and we have provided for significant mitigation through stormwater investment, one at Takanini North, which is beyond the floodplain but which contributes, and one right in the middle called Takanini South, which is within the floodplain, reflects similar characteristics to Awakiri, but we're saying no. We just frankly run out of money to look at Takanini South now? Is that the primary reason? I get the Phil Jaggard evidence previously on Takanini South, and I accept that the cost would be extraordinary and disproportionate for the ratepayers. But is the primary reason here about money? Because if it's about money, that's fine, but that argument hasn't really been applied evenly across that wider footprint.
Councillor Newman, there are probably two parts to this. In terms of the cost growth, you're right. A solution was initiated, stuff was done, and so of course the FDS can't undo that. So we accept that's what was done and that was the decision, and we live by that. In terms of, say, Takanini South, yes, the costs are prohibitive. There's also the view that mitigation can't be found. At the extent of the catchment, the floodplain, the nature of it, and it's not just the flooding, it's also the soils and that stuff you know about, that there really isn't a solution, and that therefore one should not give the signal that development is possible and, or appropriate, when from a stormwater perspective it isn't really possible, unless, you're right, you can of course throw billions at it. The council doesn't have billions to throw at it, and whether individual landowners can throw billions at it is probably not viable either.
Yes, you're probably right, but it's, I mean, as you know, our debate has always been about whether we should require them to pay their hundreds of millions or billions, not us. But the other thing that I wanted to ask you, Jacques, and reserve my right to speak, is that regrettably the Resource Management Act doesn't allow council stormwater engineers to consider the cumulative effects of stormwater when considering applications for development. Are we trying to effectively use the FDS to achieve that outcome, notwithstanding what the RMA doesn't provide for?
I would say what the FDS aims to achieve is to give a very clear and consistent message to development in those areas, that within the floodplain we don't believe that development is appropriate and that we should not be allowing further urban development in dumb places. I'm just going to use that word. That's the key message. Exactly what that means, the exact boundary of it, what kind of, if any, development other than urban might be appropriate, that is all a decision for the RMA process. The FDS doesn't actually change the zoning. And so I don't think we're trying to get around the RMA. We are trying to work with the RMA, but to, in that process, actually take account of the cumulative effects, because you're right, individual landowners will do little pockets and that really leads to bad outcomes. So we're trying to use that very process to think about the cumulative effect of the individual developments within that area and to take a comprehensive view. That process will then decide what it decides. You know, it's a fair and open process. But no, I don't think we are trying to find a way around it. We are trying to use the very process to actually think about the cumulative effects.
Jacques, in conclusion, because I'm not, this is the one catchment that really leaves me conflicted, and the chair will know this. It's the thing that I'm really worried about in terms of my voting on this, because other than that, I think the plan's okay. If we are considering that a piece of the catchment at Takanini should be removed because we consider that the effects cannot be reconciled, fundamentally, other than an argument about people in a floodplain, why would we provide for the concession north of the Papakura stream when we know that developments north of the Papakura stream continue to exacerbate effects south of the Papakura stream? In other words, there's a consistency argument here, isn't there? Yes.
No. Maybe I just apply a different... I absolutely understand what you're saying. I think what we're applying is a different consistency, because we're also looking beyond just that catchment, but also in, say, catchments in Kumio, for example. So I suppose the principle we're applying is there is a difference between within the floodplain and outside of the floodplain, yet still contributing downstream. And so that's really the difference between, with the red flags, saying we do believe that development outside of the floodplain is possible. It's going to require extensive mitigation because of the contributing to the flow and the downstream. But we do think there is a difference in that some development certainly would be possible. And the key difference is, I suppose, it does actually come down to whether you knowingly allow more people within the floodplain. But yeah, so I would like to believe there is a consistency in principle. It might just be a slightly different one from the one how you view it.
Can I ask, Chair, if I can ask Megan Tyler, if she's got any idea of how many developments have been consented through the HASHAR process for SHAs, any of the plan changes that have proceeded in recent years where people have been allowed to develop within floodplains. I think it's difficult to address an argument today that we're not going to allow for development in floodplains when that has happened for many, many years. and probably actually, and regrettably so, I might add, because I don't think that you should, some of these developments haven't been the best, but developing in floodplains, unfortunately, is something that has happened before. The issue is that the mitigations to address the effects of that have been either poor or extremely poor, but they have been permitted, not just by commissioners, but sometimes these have been allowed by council. Is that correct?
Through the chair, thanks for the question, Councillor Newman. To your first point, no, I don't know the numbers at all, so I'm not even going to guess. And the only thing I would say, and if you have further questions, clearly you can ask them, but the only thing I would say in relation to this is, yes, we have a lot of houses, and business in floodplains in Auckland. There was a clear sense of a change in direction, or certainly a change of thinking of direction from this council, particularly coming out of earlier in the year, but not exclusively. And so we're doing that work, and we will be working with you around changes to the unitary plan and whether or not it is still appropriate for housing in particular to be in floodplains. But look, that's a bigger matter. But we are working towards the newer direction, and what we are recommending to you, particularly in relation to this area and this form of hazard, this is our recommendation to you around Takanini.
Thank you, Chair.
Kia ora. I might just have, we do have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 more questioners, and I'm deciding whether we debate or before lunch. But anyway, I think we do need a 5-minute break before those questions. Sorry, I know that's awkward to stop in the middle of questions, but I think everyone needs a 5-minute breather. Cool. So be back in 5 minutes, those online. Thank you.